Hi guys, so I thought I'd come to you today to talk a little bit about getting back into reading and how I read so much. Those are both topics I get asked questions on a regular basis, and I think most booktubers do. I considered making individual videos about both topics, but I feel like I can't quite separate them in my mind or in my discussion of either. Now, I will say before I start is that compared to some, I don't read as much. Compared to others, I read tons. It's all very relative how much you read and what you consider to be a lot. I think I read quite a lot. I read on average about 70 to 90 books a year, or have done over the past few years at least. I'm happy with that. I'm in no dire need to increase that number, and I don't mind if I read less than that, to be honest. But I'm sure some of you are looking for tips on how to read a little bit more if you're just not into that regular reading flow that I think makes all the difference. Now, when I say get back into reading, what I'm referring to for me is the first 2 years of university, basically. I was an avid reader as a child and a teenager, but finishing up secondary school and starting university completely threw me through a loop, and it completely overturned my reading habits. I effectively read nothing recreationally in the first 2 years of university. I listened to a couple of audiobooks and read things for university. And I didn't even do an English literature degree, so it wasn't as though I was reading 40 books a term or year or whatever crazy number of books people read for English literature degrees. And I think that's what causes a lot of people to have long-term reading slumps or small-term reading slumps, is changes in your lifestyle, and that has a massive effect on your reading, and it did for me. I think when you get to that point though as well, where you've gone for such a long time not reading recreationally, it's really hard to get back into it for one main reason, and that's because you've either not discovered or have forgotten the joy of reading. Now, I read for fun. I also love to gain knowledge and expand as a human being, but what compels me to continue to read so much is the joy it brings me. And rediscovering that joy of reading was what got me back into reading. Now, the way I did that was through discovering BookTube. If you're already watching this video, there's a good chance you've already discovered BookTube, so I don't know if that's terribly helpful advice, but I think what it was about discovering BookTube was, first of all, listening to other people talk about books got me really excited and intrigued by other stories. Then engaging in that conversation myself, whether it was making the occasional video on my old channel about books, I think I made maybe like 3 videos on that channel about books, or reading and writing Goodreads reviews, joining Goodreads groups, commenting on people's videos, and just involving myself in that conversation and discussing literature really inspired me to read a little bit more. I remember there were 3 books in particular that helped me get back into reading, because I read them all in about the space of 2 months. And like I said, I had not been reading, so to read 3 full-length novels in the space of a month was an amazing achievement for me. And those were The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, The Fault in Our Stars by John Green, and Witches Abroad by Terry Pratchett. I did actually do a video talking about all 3 of those books on my old channel, which is on this channel as well. I re-uploaded it here that you can go and watch, but it's a very old video, so don't judge me on how good it is. Reading and loving all of those books really helped me to get back into reading, and one of the things that helped me read them all so quickly was being away on a trip where I had a lot of free time but no television or internet or anything like that. And although I would also spend time exploring, my sit-down time was reading time, and I started to get back into reading in that respect. I'd had that initial spark because of BookTube, and then I had an opportunity to read a little bit more, and that really helped me. And I think that applies to reading more now as well. So one of the things I think you really need to remind yourself when you're trying to read more is that you don't necessarily have as little free time as you're thinking you do. I mean, you may be very busy. I'm very busy, I appreciate that. But quite often I think we forget that the time we're using to watch television or Netflix is time we could be reading a book. And no, you shouldn't not watch Netflix if that's what you want to do. But if you're despairing that you're not reading as much whilst you're still watching television every night, then you need to consider whether you'd like to trade some of that time in. Personally, I cannot watch television right before I go to sleep if I want to get to sleep quickly or feel relaxed before I go to sleep. Reading helps me really separate from the world, shut down my brain, tire me out a little bit before bed and help me sleep, whereas watching Netflix or television or whatever gets my brain worrying too much. And that's not to say I don't do it, but I try to make a conscious effort to read before I go to sleep every night. And even if that's just like 5 pages, that's 5 more pages than I would have read if I didn't do it at all. The other times I read and get my reading done are on my commutes. So if I'm ever travelling by bus or train, thankfully, unless it's a really long coach journey, reading on transport doesn't make me feel ill, especially if it's a train. Maybe sometimes more on buses, but on trains I am fine with reading. So I always read on my commutes if I'm getting a train or if I'm visiting Edinburgh or when I was visiting London, vice versa. However, if you walk to work or drive to work, I imagine, one way you can also fit in reading is audiobooks. I listen to about 1 audiobook a month, so that gets quite a lot of books into my year that I wouldn't otherwise be reading. I like music, but I'm not crazy about it. If I've got a long stretch of time, I'd rather be listening to an audiobook than listening to music. When I used to go to the gym, I listened to audiobooks instead of music, and in other circumstances like that. And that squeezes in about a book a month for me, which is obviously amazing and bumps up my number for the year. I also read on my lunch break at work. I've always done this ever since I got back into reading, whether it be when I was working in retail or now working at Pan Macmillan. On my lunch break, I like to get some reading done if possible. I will sit and just enjoy my book and get a little bit more reading done. And those are the main times in the day I read. Travelling, lunch breaks and bedtime. I also think it's worth noting that I don't read a ton of 700 page long books, and it's important to realise if you're reading less books than other people but are reading really large books, then that's not you reading less, that's incredibly impressive. A lot of the books I read are around 300 pages, and of course it's easier to read 300 page books than it is to read one 1,000 page book. It's just a matter of how quick it is to read a certain number of words, isn't it? So that also bumps up my numbers, but I don't think that's necessarily something you should prioritise if you prefer longer books. The number of books you read in a year isn't that important as long as you are regularly reading and getting the joy from it that it can give you. I'd also suggest joining book groups, and even if there's not a book group near you, although there might be if you look into your local library or online, you might be able to find people that are in a book club, or your university if you're studying. There are also online book clubs. I run an online book club, the Feminist Orchestra, and actually having the Feminist Orchestra pretty much guarantees that I know there'll be one book that I will read that month, and that'll be the book club book. I don't always have the time to engage in the discussion about it, but as much as I can, I try to make sure to fit in that book, and having that little bit of pressure, but a pressure that I've chosen to take on as opposed to say books for school or university, having that little deadline makes me make sure I read that book, and I think that's actually really helpful. I also think one of the reasons I read so much is that I don't force myself to read things that I'm not enjoying. I DNF books, and I generally don't pick up books that I know I have absolutely no interest in, because I know reading something like that will take me 3 times as long as it would to read something I'm enjoying, which is a waste of time if you're trying to read more, and won't exactly inspire me to pick up my next read, because if I don't enjoy the process, it's not going to make me feel like, oh, I must read something else because reading's so much fun if I've just had a negative reading experience. And I think that is the thing. At the end of the day, if you're trying to get back into reading, if you're trying to read more, is to remember the joy of reading, and to seek that joy out and rediscover that joy, and that will help you read as much as you possibly can. And that's also important to bear in mind, not to compare yourself to other people. Whatever works for you is enough, and don't feel guilty if there's been 2 years in your life where you barely read anything. I don't feel guilty. Just make sure that you're reading what you want to read. I hope this was somehow helpful. I don't feel like I have any very innovative, unique tips to provide anybody, because that is pretty much how I read, and that's it. It's not that crazy or special, but I know that sometimes just hearing somebody else talk about their reading habits can help you a little bit, so I hope you did find this useful, and do let me know when you find it easiest to fit in reading. It might help somebody else in the comments down below. And also, if you have any experiences of not reading for a long time and then getting back into it, I'd love to hear about those too. Until next time though guys, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye!